The gardens of West Haven Manor bloomed with late spring roses and the crystalline laughter of society's most privileged women, all assembled for the annual charity luncheon benefiting the Foundling Hospital. White-clothed tables dotted the manicured lawns like ships in a sea of emerald grass, while liveried footmen navigated between clusters of ladies carrying silver teapots and tiered stands of cucumber sandwiches and lemon cakes. Jessica Fowler had claimed what she privately called her survival position, a small wrought-iron table tucked beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak tree, far enough from the main gathering to avoid notice, but close enough to maintain the appearance of participation. From this vantage point, she could watch the pageantry of high society without becoming part of it. At 28, Jessica had mastered the delicate choreography of graceful withdrawal. It wasn't that she lacked beauty. Her chestnut hair still caught the light when she moved, and her hazel eyes retained the intelligence that had once made her a sought-after conversation partner. But 3 years ago, when her father's shipping investments had collapsed spectacularly, dragging the Fowler name into bankruptcy proceedings that dominated the society pages for months, everything had changed. The suitors who had once filled her dance card vanished. The friends who had whispered confidences during afternoon calls found pressing engagements elsewhere. Even the charitable invitations like this one came with a particular flavor of condescension, a reminder that she was now an object of pity rather than an equal. Self-preservation had taught her to accept these diminished circumstances with outward grace while maintaining an interior fortress of dignity. She had learned which conversations to avoid, which glances to pretend not to see, and precisely how to position herself at gatherings to minimize the uncomfortable sympathy that well-meaning ladies offered like poisoned sweets. She lifted her teacup, her mother's last remaining piece of fine china, carefully transported in her reticule because she couldn't bear to drink from borrowed porcelain, and allowed herself a moment of bitter satisfaction. At least here, alone beneath her oak tree, no one could see the careful mending along the seams of her dove-gray dress, or notice that her gloves had been turned inside out to hide the worn fingertips. Small victories in an ongoing war of appearances. The satisfaction lasted exactly as long as it took for a shadow to fall across her table. Jessica looked up to find Francesca Thornton standing before her with the bearing of a general surveying a battlefield. The Dowager Duchess cut an imposing figure even among London's elite. Silver blonde hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure, sapphires glittering at her throat and ears, her lavender silk gown a masterpiece of restrained opulence. But it was her eyes that truly commanded attention, pale blue and sharp as winter ice, assessing everything they touched with calculating precision. "Miss Fowler," the Duchess's voice carried the warmth of a January morning. "Miss Fowler, how fortuitous to find you here. May I?" She didn't wait for permission before settling into the chair opposite, arranging her skirts with practiced elegance. Jessica's pulse quickened with instinctive wariness. Francesca Thornton was not a woman who sought out impoverished gentlewomen for casual conversation. She was known throughout society for her strategic mind, her ruthless protection of the Thornton name, and her uncanny ability to identify weakness and exploit it. "Your Grace," Jessica managed to keep her voice steady, though her fingers tightened imperceptibly around her teacup. "This is unexpected." "I imagine it is." The Duchess's smile was the sort that made flowers wilt. "I've been meaning to speak with you for some time, Miss Fowler, about your family, your situation, your rather limited prospects." The words landed like blows disguised as polite concern. Jessica felt heat climb her neck, but years of practice kept her expression neutral. "I wasn't aware my circumstances were of interest to your Grace.
"Oh, but they are." The Duchess leaned forward slightly, and Jessica caught the predatory gleam in those ice-chip eyes. "You see, my son, the Duke of Thornton, finds himself in need of a wife, someone from an old family, with impeccable bloodlines and proper breeding, someone who understands duty and discretion." She paused, letting the implications settle. "Someone who has nowhere else to turn." Jessica's breath caught. Around them, the garden party continued its civilized performance, laughter floating on the breeze, spoons clinking against fine china, ladies discussing the latest scandal in hushed, delighted tones. But in this small pocket of shade beneath the oak tree, the world had narrowed to two women and a proposition that tasted of poison. "I don't understand." The lie was automatic, a defensive reflex, though Jessica understood perfectly. She simply needed time to think, to find the trap hidden in this offer. Francesca's smile widened, showing teeth. "Don't you? Let me speak plainly, Miss Fowler. Your family is drowning. The debts your father left are substantial, and your creditors are growing impatient. Your mother's health declines, while you struggle to maintain appearances, with dresses that have been altered so many times they're barely decent. And your sister, sweet, innocent Emily, will never have a proper season, will never attract a respectable match, while carrying the stain of your father's failures." Each word was a surgical strike, precisely aimed. Jessica felt the carefully constructed walls of her dignity cracking, exposing the raw desperation she had worked so hard to conceal. "Now," the Duchess continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than a shout, "I am prepared to make you an offer. You will become engaged to my son. Within 6 months, you will marry him in a ceremony befitting his station. In exchange, I will settle every one of your family's debts, provide your mother with a comfortable living, and ensure your sister has not just a season, but a spectacular debut that will erase any hint of scandal from the Fowler name." Jessica's mind raced, searching for options that didn't exist. "And if I refuse?" The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Francesca's expression hardened into something ancient and merciless. "Then I will ensure that the few scraps of credit your family still possesses vanish overnight. Those creditors I mentioned, several owe me considerable favors. Your mother's cottage, the one she's clinging to so desperately, sits on land whose mortgage I purchased last month. And your sister's chances of marriage?" She made a dismissive gesture. "I know everyone who matters in this city, Miss Fowler. One word from me, and Emily will be as unmarriageable as a common shop girl." The garden blurred at the edges of Jessica's vision. This couldn't be happening. This was madness, a nightmare dressed in afternoon tea and polite society. But looking into Francesca Thornton's eyes, seeing the absolute certainty there, Jessica knew with terrible clarity that every word was true. "Why?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Why me? Why this?" "Because you are precisely what my son needs: breeding without expectations, beauty without vanity, and most importantly, desperation without alternatives." Francesca rose, smoothing her skirts with finality. "I'll expect your answer by tomorrow evening, Miss Fowler. A simple note will suffice, but do consider carefully." She leaned down, close enough that Jessica could smell her jasmine perfume. "Your sister is only 16, such a tender age to watch her future die because of your pride." Then she was gone, gliding back toward the main gathering as though she'd done nothing more remarkable than comment on the weather. Somewhere a woman laughed, a bird sang in the branches above, the sun continued its lazy arc across the sky. But for Jessica Fowler, everything had changed. The comfortable isolation of her oak tree felt suddenly like a cage, and the life she had been so carefully managing, the dignified poverty, the quiet survival, had just been revealed as an illusion. She had no choices left, only Francesca Thornton's ultimatum and the 6 months that would determine whether she would surrender her future to save her family or watch them all drown in the ruins her father had left behind. The teacup trembled in her hands. Very carefully, she set it down before it could shatter.
Jessica didn't remember leaving Westhaven Manor. The hired hackney rattled through London's evening streets while her mind replayed Francesca Thornton's words on an endless, sickening loop. 6 months. Marriage. No alternatives. The city blurred past her window, gas lamps flickering to life, well-dressed couples emerging for evening entertainments, a world that had continued spinning while hers stopped entirely. The cab deposited her on Henrietta Street, where the Fowler townhouse sagged between its prosperous neighbors like a beggar at a ball. 3 years ago, this street had been respectable. Now the peeling paint and rusted ironwork announced their poverty to anyone who cared to look. Jessica paid the driver with coins she couldn't spare and climbed the steps to a door that no longer had a brass knocker, sold last winter to pay the coal merchant. Inside, darkness pressed close. They kept only the kitchen and her mother's bedroom lit after sunset, rationing candles like liquid gold. Jessica stood in the entrance hall, where she'd once welcomed suitors and friends, now reduced to shadows and Holland-covered furniture, too broken to sell, too laden with memory to abandon. A wet, rattling cough echoed from upstairs. Her mother. The sound had become as constant as breathing, a metronome counting down to an ending Jessica refused to imagine. The doctor had been blunt during his last visit, the one they could barely afford. Another winter in this damp, freezing house would kill her. Jessica's feet carried her to her father's study, though she'd sworn never to enter it again. The room remained exactly as she'd found it 3 years ago. The desk where he'd written his final letter, the chair where she'd discovered him slumped in death, the faint smell of his pipe tobacco still clinging to the curtains like a ghost refusing to leave. She could still see that letter in her careful hand. The ships were lost. Everything is lost. Forgive me. 12 vessels. Their entire fortune invested in a single convoy, insured with a company that had collapsed the week before the storm hit. Catastrophic timing that even the most cautious business mind couldn't have predicted. 1 month of bad luck had erased 3 generations of Fowler prosperity, leaving behind nothing but debts and the hollow title of gentleman's daughter. Jessica was 25 then, with suitors and prospects and a future that glittered with possibility. Emily was 13, still a child who believed their father was invincible. Their mother had taken her to bed and never truly risen again, as though grief itself had become a wasting disease. "I'll take care of us," Jessica had promised Emily that night, holding her sobbing sister in the darkness. "Everything will be fine." 3 years of survival had taught her the exact price of that promise. It cost dignity swallowed like bitter medicine. It cost nights spent mending the same dress for the 4th time. It cost watching Emily's eyes dim each time Jessica explained why there would be no season, no debut, no future beyond this crumbling house. A soft sound made Jessica turn. Emily stood in the doorway, wrapped in a nightgown that had been Jessica's 2 years ago, before Jessica had grown too thin for it. At 16, Emily possessed that untouched beauty that made heads turn. Golden hair that caught lamplight, wide blue eyes, the kind of innocence that society's predators circled like sharks. "Jess?" her voice quavered. "What's wrong? You look—" Jessica crossed the room and pulled her sister close, breathing in the cheap lavender water that was all they could afford. Emily's hair smelled like hope and trust and everything worth protecting. Over her sister's shoulder, Jessica saw their reflection in the darkened window,
two ghosts in a house full of them. Francesca Thornton's threat whispered through Jessica's mind. Your sister is only 16, such a tender age to watch her future die because of your pride. There was no choice. There had never been a choice. Everything's fine, Jessica lied, perfecting the art. Go back to bed, darling. Everything's going to be fine. She held Emily until her sister's breathing steadied, then guided her back upstairs. After Emily's door closed, Jessica returned to her father's desk and drew out their last sheet of good stationery, the paper they'd been saving for something important, though what could be more important than this? Her hand didn't shake. That surprised her. Perhaps she'd already begun the transformation into whatever Francesca Thornton wanted her to become, a woman who could sign away her future with steady fingers and dry eyes. Your Grace, I accept your terms. Yours in duty, Jessica Fowler. She sealed the letter with plain red wax, no family crest anymore, that was sold with the silver, and set it by the door for tomorrow's post. Then she climbed to her narrow attic bedroom and lay awake, listening to her mother's cough 2 floors below and Emily's peaceful breathing next door. 6 months until she became the Duchess of Thornton. 6 months to learn to love her cage.
The summons arrived within 24 hours, delivered by a liveried footman whose coat buttons probably cost more than Jessica's entire wardrobe. Francesca Thornton's handwriting was as precise as a blade. Tomorrow, 3 o'clock, Thornton House. Do not be late. Jessica stood before the mansion's imposing entrance at precisely 2 minutes before 3, her best dress, a deep blue silk that had survived 4 alterations, pressed and proper. The butler who admitted her wore an expression of profound neutrality, as though women arrived daily to sell themselves into marriage. Perhaps they did. He led her through corridors that spoke of generations of wealth, oil paintings in gilt frames, marble floors that gleamed like ice, furniture that could have fed her family for months. Each room whispered the same message: you don't belong here. You will never belong here. The drawing-room doors opened to reveal a man standing at the window, his back rigid as iron. Even from behind, Joel Thornton radiated tension, broad shoulders, tall frame, every line of his body suggesting barely leashed fury. When he turned, Jessica's breath caught despite herself. He was nothing like she'd imagined, not soft with privilege or cold with aristocratic disdain. Instead, his face was all harsh angles and severity, dark eyes that assessed her with the precision of a surgeon planning an incision. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, disrupting the patrician perfection of his features. He looked like a man who'd been at war, though he never left England. Miss Fowler. His voice was cultured but edged with something dangerous. How convenient that you're so accommodating. The words landed like a slap. Jessica lifted her chin, pride flaring despite everything. Your Grace, how fortunate that you have a mother willing to procure wives through blackmail. His eyes flashed, surprise perhaps, or approval. So she told you the truth. I half expected her to dress it up in romantic nonsense about mutual benefit and social obligation. She was refreshingly honest about what I am, a transaction, a solution to whatever problem requires you to marry someone too desperate to refuse. And yet you're here. Joel crossed his arms, studying her like a puzzle missing pieces, despite knowing exactly what this is. Despite knowing I have no choice, you mean? The bitterness escaped before she could cage it. Tell me, Your Grace, are you equally enthusiastic about this arrangement, or are you simply better at hiding your resentment? Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor. You think I want this, to have my life orchestrated like a stage play while my mother pulls the strings?
He laughed, sharp and humorless. "I've spent 32 years as her pawn. You're simply the latest move in a game I've never been allowed to quit." The admission hung between them, raw and unexpected. Jessica had prepared herself for a willing accomplice, a cold aristocrat who viewed her as property acquired. Instead, she'd found another prisoner, one who'd been captive far longer. Then why? The drawing-room doors swept open. Francesca Thornton entered like winter personified, her pale blue gown immaculate, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "How delightful! You're already becoming acquainted." The transformation was instantaneous. Joel's fury smoothed into polished courtesy as Joel crossed to Jessica, offering his arm with practiced grace. "Miss Fowler was just admiring the gardens. I thought we might take a turn outside, Mother, if you'll permit." The hand moved to his arm automatically, matching his performance with her own. "His Grace has been most welcoming. We were discussing our shared interest in literature." "Were you?" The Duchess' gaze moved between them, calculating. How fortuitous! Shared interests make for such harmonious marriages. Joel's muscles tensed beneath Jessica's fingers, but his smile never wavered. "Indeed, Miss Fowler's knowledge of philosophy is quite impressive. We were debating Kant's categorical imperative." The lie came easily to him, smooth as silk. Jessica found herself responding in kind, weaving a fabricated conversation about moral duty and rational action that they'd never had. Their words intertwined with surprising fluency, each building on the other's invention, until even Francesca's sharp eyes softened with satisfaction. "You see?" The Duchess settled into a chair, observing them like a general surveying conquered territory. "I knew you'd suit. Such natural chemistry." Joel's muscles tightened almost imperceptibly on Jessica's arm, frustration or warning, she couldn't tell. But as they continued their performance, spinning lies into something that looked disturbingly like truth, she realized with cold clarity that this might be the most dangerous part of all. Not the coercion, not the loss of freedom, but how easily they could pretend, how naturally deception came when survival demanded it. And how terrifying it was that some part of her didn't want to stop.
Jessica's belongings arrived at Thornton House in 2 modest trunks that looked like orphans in the cavernous entrance hall. A young maid with kind eyes and capable hands led her through corridors that seemed to multiply with each turn, finally stopping before double doors carved with elaborate roses. "The Rose Suite, miss," the maid said, pushing them open. "Her Grace thought you'd find it comfortable." Comfortable was an obscenity for what lay beyond those doors. The sitting-room alone was larger than Jessica's entire bedroom at Henrietta Street, decorated in shades of cream and gold that caught the afternoon light. Velvet curtains framed windows overlooking manicured gardens. The bedroom beyond held a 4-poster bed draped in silk, a wardrobe that could house a family, and a dressing table crowned with crystal bottles she was afraid to touch. Jessica stood frozen in the doorway while something painful lodged in her chest. 3 years ago she'd lived in rooms like this. 3 years ago luxury had been ordinary. Now it felt like mockery, a reminder of everything her father's death had stolen, everything she'd sold herself to reclaim. "Miss," the maid's voice was gentle, "are you well?" Jessica blinked hard, forcing back the tears that threatened. "Yes, I'm sorry. It's very beautiful." "I'm Clara, miss. I'll be looking after you." She began unpacking with efficient movements, not commenting when she discovered how few dresses Jessica owned, how worn each one was. "Her Grace mentioned you'd need a new wardrobe. The modiste arrives tomorrow." Of course, Francesca wouldn't allow her son's fiancée to appear in altered gowns. She'd be dressed like a doll, polished and perfected until no one could see the poverty beneath the silk. As Clara worked, she talked, a steady stream of household information delivered with practiced neutrality.
which servants to trust, which corridors led where, when the family took meals. But when she mentioned Francesca, her voice dropped to a whisper. "The Duchess always gets what she wants, miss. Best to remember that. Fighting her is like fighting the tide, exhausting and pointless." The warning settled like ice in Jessica's stomach. She nodded, not trusting her voice. By evening, Jessica couldn't bear the suffocating luxury any longer. She slipped out through the garden doors, following stone paths that wound through rose beds and sculpted hedges. The estate sprawled in every direction, vast enough that she could almost forget the house looming behind her. The stables appeared around a bend, long, elegant buildings that probably housed horses worth more than the Fowler townhouse. Jessica was about to turn back when she heard it, a man's voice, low and gentle, speaking words she couldn't distinguish. She found Joel in one of the stalls, running his hands along a bay mare's neck with surprising tenderness. His coat was discarded, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, and for the first time since she'd met him, his face had lost its harsh tension. He looked younger here, almost peaceful, murmuring to the horse like she was the only creature in the world that mattered. "She's beautiful," Jessica said before she could stop herself. Joel's head snapped up, peace fracturing back into guarded wariness, but the mare nickered softly, nosing his shoulder, and some of the softness remained. "Artemis," he said, finally. "I raised her from a foal. She's the only thing in this house that's truly mine." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Jessica moved closer, letting Artemis investigate her hand. The horse's breath was warm and hay-sweet, impossibly gentle. "Your mother doesn't ride." "My mother doesn't approve of anything that can't be controlled or displayed." Joel's jaw tightened. "Horses are too honest for her taste. They react to what you are, not what you pretend to be." Jessica watched him stroke Artemis's nose, this man who wore armor everywhere except here. In the stable's golden light, surrounded by the honest smell of horses and hay, she saw what he might have been without Francesca's machinations, someone who valued freedom over duty, gentleness over power. "I used to ride," she heard herself say, "before. My father taught me." Joel's dark eyes met hers, and something shifted between them, recognition perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. Two people who'd lost pieces of themselves to circumstances beyond their control, finding brief refuge in a place that demanded nothing but honesty. "Would you like to ride tomorrow?" The invitation emerged carefully, as though he were testing unfamiliar ground. "Artemis has a sister, Athena. She's spirited but kind." Jessica thought of Francesca's careful choreography, the performance they'd be expected to maintain. But here in the stables, with an evening light slanting through the rafters and a horse's peaceful breathing the only sound, the cage felt slightly less suffocating. "I'd like that," she said, and meant it.
The formal dining room could have seated 40 guests comfortably, which made the three of them gathered at one end feel like actors on an overlarge stage. Crystal glittered under chandelier light, reflecting off china so fine Jessica could see shadows through it. Each course arrived with military precision, served by footmen who moved like ghosts. Francesca presided at the head of the table with the authority of a general deploying troops. She'd changed for dinner into midnight blue silk, sapphires at her throat catching light like captured ice. Between bites of poached salmon, she delivered her campaign strategy. "The engagement announcement will appear in the Times on Monday," she said, dabbing her lips with a napkin that probably cost more than Jessica's monthly food budget. "We'll host a ball here on the 15th to make it official. Invitations have already been sent." Jessica's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "That's only 2 weeks away." "Precisely. Strike while society's curiosity is fresh." Francesca's smile was all teeth.
Lady Ashford's musicale the week after, then the Pemberton garden party. I've prepared a list of families you'll need to cultivate, strategic connections that will prove useful after the wedding. Joel sat across from Jessica, his face carved from stone. He hadn't spoken since they'd sat down, merely pushed food around his plate with mechanical precision. The wedding itself will be at St. George's on December 20th, 6 months from today, as agreed. I've already engaged the flowers, the musicians, the menu for the wedding breakfast. All you need to do is appear and say your vows. All you need to do, as if surrendering her future was as simple as showing up. I've also prepared letters for you to copy in your own hand, Miss Fowler. Carefully worded notes to key society matrons expressing your joy at the match. The Duchess produced a leather folder from beside her plate. Your penmanship is acceptable, I trust. Quite acceptable, Your Grace. Jessica kept her voice level, though rage burned beneath her breastbone. She was to be not just a purchased bride, but a puppet, speaking Francesca's words with her own hand. The Duchess continued outlining expectations through dessert, a complicated soufflé that tasted like air and duty. When she finally rose, declaring she had correspondence to attend to, Jessica felt like a prisoner granted reprieve. Don't linger too long, she warned from the doorway. Propriety, even between engaged couples. The doors closed behind her with decisive finality. Jessica reached for her wineglass, needing something to steady her hands. Across the table, Joel's rigid posture finally collapsed. I'm sorry. The words emerged rough, as though dragged from somewhere deep. Thorough. Jessica laughed, brittle and sharp. Is that what we're calling tyranny now? Joel leaned back in his chair, exhaustion written across his features. She's been planning this for months, possibly years, waiting for the right candidate, someone with the proper bloodline and sufficient desperation. Flattering. I didn't mean... He stopped, dragged a hand through his hair. Christ, I'm making this worse. What I meant is that she's been searching for someone she could control completely, someone who couldn't refuse or escape. Jessica set down her glass carefully. Is that why you agreed? Because you can't escape either? I haven't been able to escape since I was 8 years old. The admission came quietly, weighted with decades of resentment. But at least I understand the cage I'm in. You deserve to know the truth of what you've agreed to. Something shifted in Jessica's chest. She'd expected continued performance, aristocratic distance, not this raw honesty offered like an olive branch. Then let's make our own agreement, she said. If we're going to survive this, we need at least one person we can be honest with. Joel's dark eyes met hers across the candlelit table. Honesty between us, even if we must lie to everyone else? Especially then, Jessica leaned forward. No pretense when we're alone, no performance, just the truth, however ugly. Agreed. He extended his hand across the table. When Jessica took it, his grip was firm and warm and surprisingly gentle. Then I'll start with truth. I didn't know about the threats against your sister. Jessica's breath caught. What? My mother told you you'd accepted for financial reasons, the debt forgiveness, your mother's care. She never mentioned blackmail. His jaw tightened, fury igniting behind his eyes. What exactly did she threaten? That she'd ensure Emily never found a husband, that she'd seize our remaining assets, that my sister, who's only 16, would watch her future die because I refused. The words spilled out, carrying 3 days of suppressed fear. Emily still believes in fairy tales, Joel, in happy endings and honorable men. I couldn't let your mother destroy that. Joel's hand tightened around hers. My mother, he said, softly, is a monster, and I've been complicit in her schemes for far too long. What does that mean? His expression hardened into something determined. It means things are going to change, starting now.
The Ashford ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, their light refracting through crystal chandeliers and champagne glasses until the entire room seemed to shimmer. Jessica stood at the top of the marble staircase, Joel's arm solid beneath her gloved hand, and felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes turned toward them. Her new gown, cream silk overlaid with gold lace that Francesca had commissioned from London's most exclusive modiste, felt like armor and costume simultaneously. The emeralds at her throat, borrowed from the Thornton family vault, were worth more than her father's entire estate had been. She looked the part of a duchess. She felt like an impostor about to be exposed. "Breathe," Joel murmured, his voice too low for anyone else to hear. "They can smell fear like hounds smell blood." Jessica managed a breath, then another. Together they descended into the glittering sea of society. The announcement had appeared in the Times 3 days ago, carefully worded to suggest a love match between the distinguished Duke and the daughter of the late lamented shipping merchant. Reality, as always, was far less romantic. But society devoured the narrative Francesca had crafted, the noble rescuing the impoverished beauty, duty meeting sentiment in perfect harmony. Lady Pemberton was the first to intercept them, her feathered turban trembling with barely suppressed curiosity. "Your Grace, and Miss Fowler, or should I say, the future Duchess, what a delightful surprise this engagement was." "Delightful indeed," Jessica replied, her smile practiced to perfection. "His Grace has been most kind." "Kind?" Lady Pemberton's eyes sharpened. "My dear, surely this is more than kindness. Why, the way he looks at you—" She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Tell me, was it terribly romantic? How did he propose?" Jessica's mind went blank. They'd never discussed this detail, never coordinated their lies about— "In the rose garden at Thornton House," Joel interjected smoothly, his hand moving to the small of Jessica's back in a gesture that looked possessive and tender. "I couldn't bear to wait another moment. Jessica has a way of making even the most carefully laid plans obsolete." The truth beneath the lie, that Francesca's machinations had forced them together, made Jessica's smile feel less false. "His Grace is too generous. I was quite speechless." As any woman would be, Lady Pemberton sighed with theatrical pleasure before sweeping away to share this romantic detail with her circle. The evening became an exhausting parade of similar encounters. Lady Hartwick wanted to know about wedding plans. Mrs. Dalton inquired pointedly about Jessica's family connections, her tone suggesting she'd already calculated exactly how far the Fowlers had fallen. Lord Ashford himself offered congratulations, while his eyes assessed Jessica like livestock at market. But it was Lady Catherine Winters who delivered the sharpest cut, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "How fortunate for Miss Fowler that the Duke has such a charitable nature. Some might say suspiciously fortunate, given the timing of her family's difficulties." The implication hung in the air that Jessica had trapped Joel through desperation or scandal, that this was anything but the love match Francesca had advertised. Jessica felt heat climb her neck, felt the old shame of poverty threatening to choke her. Joel's arm tightened around her waist. "Lady Catherine," his voice could have frozen wine, "I wasn't aware you'd become an expert on fortune, though given your own family's recent investments, perhaps you should focus on your own financial affairs rather than speculating about mine." Lady Catherine paled, the reminder of her husband's gambling debts landing like a slap. She retreated with mumbled excuses, while Joel guided Jessica toward the dance floor, his expression thunderous. "Ignore her," Joel said as they took position for a waltz. "She's bitter because her daughter expected me to propose last season." The music began, and Joel swept her into the dance with surprising grace. Jessica had forgotten this, the pleasure of moving in perfect synchronization with a skilled partner, the temporary suspension of everything but rhythm and motion. "You're handling this remarkably well,"
Joel said as they turned. "Most women would have fled by now. Most women haven't spent 3 years learning to smile while society dissects their failures." Jessica met his eyes, finding something like understanding there. "This is merely another performance." "No," his voice lowered as he pulled her infinitesimally closer, still proper but intimate. "You're stronger than all of them, Jessica. Every person in this room would crumble under what you've endured. They just lack the courage to admit it." The words hit something deep in her chest, unexpected and dangerous. Jessica had armed herself against cruelty and condescension, but genuine respect from Joel bypassed every defense. "Thank you," she whispered. As they waltzed through the glittering crowd, Jessica realized with startling clarity that something had shifted. Joel was no longer her captor's son, the unwilling accomplice to Francesca's schemes. He was becoming something far more complicated, an ally in this elaborate charade, and possibly, terrifyingly, a friend.
It began the morning after the ball, when Jessica discovered Joel already seated at the small wrought-iron table in the east garden, 2 cups of tea steaming in the cool air. He looked up from his book as she approached, surprise flickering across his features before settling into something like invitation. "I didn't mean to intrude," Jessica said, already turning back. "You're not," he gestured to the empty chair. "I come here most mornings to escape the house. You're welcome to join me if you'd like." The offer was casual, but something in his tone suggested it was anything but. Jessica sat, accepting the tea he poured with hands that had learned precision through years of avoiding his mother's scrutiny. They talked about the ball at first, dissecting performances, laughing quietly at Lady Pemberton's theatrical sighs. But as the sun climbed higher and servants passed at respectful distances, the conversation deepened into territories Jessica hadn't explored since her father's death. "Have you read Mill's On Liberty?" Joel asked, tapping the book in his lap. Jessica's chest tightened with something like hunger. 3 times! His argument about individual sovereignty versus social tyranny. She stopped, suddenly self-conscious. Ladies weren't supposed to have opinions on political philosophy. But Joel leaned forward, eyes bright with interest. "You disagree with his harm principle?" "Not disagree, question." The words tumbled out, months of intellectual starvation breaking through careful restraint. "Mill argues we're free to act as we please until we harm others. But what about harm we can't see? Structural harm. Your mother isn't raising her hand against anyone, yet she's destroyed lives through financial manipulation and social coercion." Joel's voice was quiet, almost wondering. "I've never heard anyone make that connection." "My father used to say philosophy only matters if it explains the world we actually live in." Jessica stared into her teacup, memory sharp as glass. "He taught me to question everything, even comfortable ideas." "He sounds like he was remarkable." "He was human, brilliant and flawed, and ultimately broken by circumstances he couldn't control." She looked up, finding Joel's gaze steady and oddly gentle. "Does that make him less remarkable, that he failed?" "It makes him real. Perfection is the domain of statues and dead saints. The rest of us just muddle through, trying not to cause too much damage." The conversation became ritual. Each morning, Jessica would find Joel waiting with tea and whatever book currently occupied his thoughts. They debated Kant's categorical imperative and Burke's reflections on revolution. They discussed the Reform Acts and whether progress was inevitable or engineered. Joel had read widely, hungrily, as though knowledge was the only territory his mother couldn't colonize. On the 5th morning, rain drove them to the conservatory. Joel stood at the window, watching water stream down glass, and spoke without turning. "I wanted to travel once, see Constantinople, the pyramids, places that exist beyond duty and expectations." His reflection in the glass looked younger, wistful. "But dukes don't abandon their responsibilities for adventure. We stay, we marry strategically, we produce heirs and manage estates, and perform our role until we're buried in the family vault."
Jessica heard the cage in his words, recognized it as kin to her own. "What stopped you? Before the engagement. My father died when I was 8. My mother made it clear that everything, the title, the estates, the family legacy, rested on my shoulders alone. Any deviation from her plan would be selfish, destructive." He finally turned to face her. "She's been preparing me for this moment my entire life. The irony is that I'm 32 and still waiting for my life to actually begin." "I understand that." Jessica moved closer, drawn by shared recognition. "I've spent 3 years in suspended animation, not quite living, not quite dying, just existing in the narrow space between pride and desperation." "Is that what this is?" Joel gestured between them. "More suspension?" "I don't know." The honesty felt dangerous and necessary. "Some days I think I'm being rescued. Others I feel like I'm simply trading one cage for another. And then there's the guilt." "What guilt?" Jessica's throat tightened. "That I got this chance when thousands of women in my position have nothing. That my sister will have a future because I was desperate enough to sell myself while other sisters starve in silence." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "I'm saved, Joel, but at what cost? And who decides which women deserve saving?" The question hung between them, weighted with complexity that had no easy answers. Joel crossed the space between them, stopping close enough that she could see gold flecks in his dark eyes. "You're not being saved, Jessica. You're surviving." His voice was rough with conviction. "There's no shame in that, only strength." The intimacy of the moment felt more profound than any physical touch. Two people standing in honest acknowledgement of their shared imprisonment, their mutual understanding that sometimes survival is the bravest choice available. Outside, rain continued its steady percussion. Inside the conservatory, surrounded by green growing things that flourished in captivity, Jessica and Joel built something fragile and vital, a connection neither of them had planned for, and both were beginning to need.
4 months into the engagement, Francesca's control tightened like a noose. The wedding preparations consumed every hour, each decision filtered through her exacting standards. Jessica endured fittings for a wedding gown she hadn't chosen, approved menu selections she'd never tasted before the day itself, and smiled through meetings with florists who took their orders exclusively from the Dowager Duchess. But it was the jewelry that finally broke Jessica's composure. Francesca summoned her to the drawing room, where a velvet case lay open on the table, revealing an elaborate diamond parure that looked less like adornment and more like chains. The necklace was a cascading waterfall of stones, ostentatious and heavy, designed to announce wealth rather than complement beauty. "You'll wear this on the wedding day," Francesca announced. "The Thornton diamonds have been worn by every duchess for 6 generations. They signify your position." Jessica stared at the jewels, seeing not beauty but ownership, a collar to mark her as property, purchased and displayed. "They're quite substantial, Your Grace. Perhaps something simpler would be more appropriate for—" "Appropriate?" Francesca's voice could cut glass. "I wasn't soliciting your opinion, Miss Fowler. I was informing you of expectations. But surely I should have some say in my own wedding." "Your wedding?" The words dripped with contempt. "My dear girl, this wedding has nothing to do with you. It's about the Thornton name, the alliance it represents, and the message it sends to society. You are simply the vessel through which those objectives are achieved." The casual cruelty landed like a physical blow. Jessica's hands clenched in her lap, years of swallowed pride warring with fresh humiliation. "I understand my position, Your Grace, but I am still a person with—" "Girls who've forgotten their place," Francesca interrupted, her voice dropping to ice, "can be reminded of it quite easily. Shall I arrange for your sister to visit? I'm sure she'd benefit from understanding exactly what your pride costs her."
The threat hung in the air, clear and vicious. Jessica's breath caught, fury and fear tangling, until she couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only sit frozen while Francesca's satisfied smile confirmed she'd won. "Mother." Joel stood in the drawing room, and the single word carried enough quiet rage to make Francesca's smile falter. He crossed the room with measured steps, his posture rigid with barely controlled anger. "This conversation is private, Joel. Miss Fowler and I are discussing wedding details." "No." Joel positioned himself beside Jessica's chair, a physical barrier between her and her mother. "You're wielding threats like weapons, again." Francesca's eyes narrowed. "I'm ensuring this wedding meets the standards our family requires. If Miss Fowler finds that too demanding, perhaps she's not suited for the role after all. Perhaps the role needs revision." Joel's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Jessica is going to be my wife, not your puppet. If you can't treat her with basic respect—" "Respect!" Francesca rose, fury transforming her elegant features into something ugly. "I've given her everything, a title, security, a future. She was nothing, less than nothing, and I elevated her from that poverty. Respect is earned, not demanded by charity cases who should be grateful for scraps." Jessica flinched, each word landing like a lash, but Joel's hand came to rest on her shoulder, warm and steady, anchoring her. "Enough." His voice cut through Francesca's tirade. "You will not speak to Jessica that way, not now, not ever. She's endured your manipulation with more grace than you deserve. That ends today." Francesca's face paled with shock, then flushed with rage. "You dare speak to me like this, after everything I've sacrificed, every plan I've made to secure your future? Plans I never asked for, a future I never wanted." Joel's hand tightened on Jessica's shoulder. "I'm done being your instrument, Mother, and Jessica is done being your target." For a long moment Francesca said nothing, her chest rising and falling with barely suppressed fury. When she finally spoke, her voice was poison disguised as calm. "How touching! Your loyalty to your little charity project." She gathered her skirts with precise movements. "But do remember, Joel, I made this match. I can unmake it just as easily. Defy me, and I'll find another bride. Miss Fowler's sister, for instance, would make a charming replacement. 16 is such a malleable age." The threat landed like a blade. Jessica felt Joel's entire body go rigid beside her, felt the air itself seem to freeze. "You wouldn't," he said quietly. Francesca's smile was triumph and cruelty perfectly blended. "Test me and discover what I would do to protect this family's interests." She swept from the room, leaving devastation in her wake. Joel's hand remained on Jessica's shoulder, trembling now with rage or fear or both. "She means it," Jessica whispered. "She'd destroy Emily just to maintain control." "I know." Joel's voice was hollow. "God help me, I know."
Jessica found him past midnight, when the house had settled into the uneasy silence of sleeping servants and extinguished lamps. Light spilled from beneath the library doors, a beacon in the darkness that drew her like a moth to flame. Joel sat at the massive oak desk, surrounded by a fortress of leather-bound volumes. Legal texts sprawled open across mahogany, their pages dense with statutes and precedents. His shirt was rumpled, cravat long abandoned, hair disheveled from countless frustrated passes of his fingers. He looked up when she entered, exhaustion and determination warring in his expression. "I can't sleep either," Jessica said quietly, closing the door behind her. "I'm trying to find a way out." Joel gestured to the books with something like desperation. "Property law,
trust documents, inheritance clauses. There has to be something, some legal mechanism that would break her financial hold over us. Jessica moved closer, scanning the open texts. And I'm realizing how thoroughly she's planned this, he laughed, bitter and sharp. Every asset is tied to trusts she controls as executor. Every creditor she's paid off now owes her favors. She's built a web of financial dependencies that would take years to unravel, if it's even possible. The defeat in his voice was devastating. Jessica sank into the chair opposite him, watching lamplight cast shadows across his haggard features. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, "not just for tonight, though that was unconscionable, for all of it. Every scheme she's orchestrated, every person she's manipulated, I've known. I've watched her destroy lives to serve the Thornton interests, and I did nothing." "Joel—" "No, let me finish." He leaned forward, eyes burning with self-recrimination. "I told myself I was choosing peace over conflict, that open defiance would only make things worse. But the truth is, I was choosing comfort over principle. It was easier to look away than to fight her. And now you're paying the price for my cowardice." The raw honesty cracked something open in Jessica's chest. She'd expected aristocratic distance, practiced deflection, not this agonized confession of complicity and shame. "You're fighting her now," she said softly. "Too late, too little." Joel's hands clenched on the desk. "She's had decades to fortify her position. I've given her 32 years of acquiescence. How do I dismantle that in 2 months?" "Maybe you can't." The admission hurt, but truth demanded acknowledgement. "Maybe we're both trapped and searching for exits that don't exist." Joel looked up sharply. "You think we should surrender?" "I think—" Jessica stopped, gathering courage. "I'm terrified, not of marrying you. That's become the least frightening part of this nightmare." The words tumbled out, months of suppressed fear breaking through careful composure. "I'm terrified of losing myself entirely, of becoming whatever automaton Francesca designs me to be, of waking up 10 years from now and not recognizing the woman in the mirror." The vulnerability felt like standing naked in winter. Jessica wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how thin her dressing gown was, how exposed she'd made herself. Joel rose and came around the desk, kneeling before her chair so their eyes were level. Slowly, carefully, he took her hands in his. His palms were warm, calloused from riding, steady beneath the tremor she could feel beneath the surface. "Listen to me." His voice was fierce, absolute. "You are not going to disappear. I won't allow it. We'll survive her together, Jessica. We'll maintain that honesty we promised each other. We'll protect the parts of ourselves she wants to erase, and we'll make sure no one else has to endure what we have." "How?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. "She controls everything." "Not everything." Joel's grip tightened. "She doesn't control what happens between these walls when we're alone. She doesn't control the alliance we're building, or the fact that we see her clearly now. And she doesn't control what we do after we're wed, when the leverage she holds begins to dissolve." "You think marriage will free us?" "I think it changes the game." His dark eyes held hers with intensity that stole breath. "Right now, she can threaten to break the engagement, to target Emily. But once we're wed, once the alliance is secured and society watches, her power becomes finite. We become permanent." Hope sparked, dangerous and fragile. "And then?" "Then we start dismantling her control piece by piece, quietly, carefully. We protect Emily, secure your mother's care, and establish our own household separate from her influence." His voice dropped to something like a vow. "I should have done this years ago, but I'm doing it now, and I'm not doing it alone." Jessica felt tears threaten, overwhelmed by the fierce protection in his words, the promise of partnership when she'd expected only performance. She turned her hands in his grip, interlacing their fingers. "We survive her together," she repeated, testing the words, finding strength in them. "Together," confirmed Joel, "and then we make damn sure she never does this to anyone else." In the lamp-lit library, surrounded by laws that couldn't save them and promises that might, Jessica and Joel forged something more binding than any contract, a pact of mutual survival and eventual vengeance against the woman who'd tried to make them both into instruments of her will.
7 days before the wedding that was supposed to seal Jessica's fate, Joel found her in the conservatory with evidence that changed everything. "I need to show you something." His voice carried urgency and something else, hope, perhaps, or vindication. He spread documents across the wrought iron table where they'd shared so many morning conversations. "I hired an investigator to audit my mother's financial claims. Look at this." Jessica leaned forward, scanning ledgers and correspondence that painted a damning picture. The shipping merchant, who supposedly held their largest debt, his business had collapsed 2 years before her father's death. The debt was impossible. The creditor demanding payment on the townhouse mortgage. That property had been sold to settle other debts. No mortgage existed. Half the financial leverage Francesca claimed was fabricated, elaborate lies designed to ensure Jessica's compliance. "She's been lying?" Jessica's hand trembled against the papers. "This entire time?" "Not all of it." Joel's jaw tightened. "Some debts are real, but she's inflated the crisis, invented creditors, manufactured urgency to make you feel trapped." He met her eyes. "Jessica, you have a choice. You've always had one. She just made sure you couldn't see it." The words detonated like artillery. Jessica sank into her chair, mind reeling through 6 months of fear and forced compliance, all built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies. "We can expose her," Joel continued, "take this evidence public, break the engagement, face whatever scandal comes." His voice roughened. "It won't be easy. Society will speculate. Your family will face judgment. But you'd be free, truly free, not just transferred from one cage to another." Free. The word felt foreign, dangerous, like something she'd forgotten the shape of. Jessica stared at the documents, seeing her liberation written in ink and duplicity. "What about Emily?" The question emerged automatically. "Your mother still has real leverage, real connections. She could—" "I have leverage too." Joel's expression hardened. "This evidence doesn't just expose her manipulation of you, it reveals years of similar schemes, other families she's coerced. If she moves against Emily, I'll make sure every drawing room in London knows exactly what Francesca Thornton is capable of." Mutually assured destruction, a stalemate built on threats instead of trust. Jessica should have felt relief, should have seized this unexpected escape route with both hands. Instead, she looked at Joel, this man who'd spent weeks researching, investigating, building a case for her freedom, when he could have simply accepted the arrangement his mother designed, who'd defended her against Francesca's cruelty, shared his dreams and resentments, taught her that partnership could exist even in captivity. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. Joel's composure cracked. "I want you to choose freely, not because of threats or debts or desperation. I want—" He stopped, dragged a hand through his hair. "I want you to have what I never did, agency." The honesty broke something open in Jessica's chest. 6 months ago, she sat alone at a garden party, invisible and desperate. Now she sat across from a man offering her the rarest gift anyone had given her since her father's death, genuine choice. She thought of their morning conversations, the intellectual hunger he'd satisfied, the way he'd positioned himself between her and her mother's cruelty, the library confession where they'd promised to survive together, the future they could build, not as captor and captive, but as partners who'd chosen each other freely.
Jessica reached across the table and took Joel's hand. "I choose you," she said, the words emerging clear and certain. "Not because I have to, not because I'm trapped, because I want to. Because somewhere in this nightmare, I fell in love with a man who gave me back my freedom and made me want to stay anyway." Joel's breath caught. "Jessica!" But not Francesca's wedding. She squeezed his hand. Not her spectacle at St. George's, with 300 witnesses and diamonds that feel like chains. "If we do this, we do it our way." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something fierce and joyful. Our way. They married 3 days later in a small chapel on the edge of London, with only Emily and Clara as witnesses. Jessica wore a simple cream dress instead of Francesca's elaborate gown. Joel had written their vows himself, promises of partnership and respect, protection and mutual growth, honesty even when comfortable lies would be easier. When the vicar pronounced them married, Jessica felt not the closing of a cage, but the opening of a door she'd chosen to walk through. Francesca arrived at Thornton House the next morning, fury radiating from every rigid line of her body. She found them in the library, Joel at his desk, Jessica beside him reviewing estate documents, unified and unrepentant. "You defied me." The words were ice and poison. "You married without my approval, without—" "You married without your control. There's a difference." Jessica rose, meeting Francesca's glacial stare with newfound steel. "We're establishing new boundaries, Your Grace. You're welcome in our home as Joel's mother, but you're no longer welcome to manipulate our lives." Francesca's face contorted. "You think this changes anything? I still have power." "Which we'll expose if you use it." Joel's voice was iron. "We have documentation of your schemes, Francesca. Stay away from Emily, stay away from Jessica's family, and learn to live with the fact that your son's marriage will be built on choice, not coercion." For the first time since Jessica had met her, Francesca Thornton looked uncertain. Then she turned and swept from the room, defeated but not destroyed, a dragon who'd lost this battle but would circle for years to come. Joel's hand found Jessica's. "Together?" he asked. "Together," she confirmed, and meant it with her whole heart.
Thank you so much for joining me on Jessica and Joel's journey from coercion to true partnership. Their story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when choice seems impossible, we can find strength in unexpected alliances and discover that love freely chosen is worth any battle. If Jessica's transformation from trapped victim to empowered woman resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What was your favorite moment? Which character spoke to your heart? And most importantly, do you think Francesca will ever truly accept defeat? Or will she always be circling, waiting for another opportunity? Want more stories like this? Stories of strong women defying impossible odds, forbidden romance blooming in the most unlikely circumstances, and the triumph of authentic connection over manipulation and control? You'll find the complete collection of my Regency Romance Tales, along with exclusive bonus chapters, alternate endings, and behind-the-scenes insights into how these stories come to life, available on my page. Each story is crafted with the same attention to emotional depth, historical detail, and satisfying endings that transform coercion into choice and captivity into freedom. Don't forget to subscribe for more compelling historical romance stories, like this video if Jessica and Joel's journey moved you, and share with anyone who loves tales of resilience, partnership, and love that conquers manipulation and control. Your support means everything and allows me to keep bringing these stories to life. Until next time, remember, you always have more power than those who try to control you believe you do. Thank you for watching,
and I'll see you in the next story.